The set goes silent. Not the silence of a break between takes. Not the silence of a crew waiting for instruction. The silence of 43 people who have just witnessed something and do not yet know what it means. John Ford stands 6 feet from Maureen O'Hara. His hand is raised. The air between them is completely still. Everyone on that hillside is waiting for her to break. Here is the story. County Galway, Ireland. Summer, 1951. The Quiet Man production. John Ford is 66 years old and he has been breaking people for 40 years. Actors, producers, studio executives, men who arrived on his sets with reputations and left with something subtracted from them that they could never quite name and never fully recover. He broke Henry Fonda. He broke John Wayne. Not completely, not permanently, but enough that Wayne understood who held the authority on a Ford set and adjusted himself accordingly. He broke Ward Bond and Harry Carey Jr. and half a dozen other men who came to his productions believing their prior accomplishments had earned them a certain standing. Ford broke standing. That was his method. That was his instrument of control. If you want more stories about the hidden power struggles that built Hollywood, subscribe now. Every week, a story they never told you. To understand what happened on that Galway hillside, you have to understand what John Ford was. He was not a cruel man in the simple sense. Cruelty implies pleasure in the suffering of others, and Ford's interest was not in suffering. His interest was in truth, in the specific and irreplaceable quality that a performance acquires when the actor has been stripped of every protective layer, every habit, every reflex, every technique deployed not in service of the character, but in service of the actor's own comfort and self-image. Ford believed that most actors were performing their safety rather than the scene, that they arrived on set already defended, already managing the impression they were making, already several removes from whatever was actually true inside them. His method for removing those defenses was calculated and systematic and deliberately brutal. He would humiliate an actor in front of the full crew. Not randomly, but at the precise moment when the humiliation would be most destabilizing. He would ignore an actor for days and then deliver a note of such surgical precision that the actor understood, in the receiving of it, that Ford had been watching everything and saying nothing, accumulating his intelligence about the performance before choosing his moment to act on it. He changed blocking without explanation. He redirected entire approaches to scenes between setups. He called takes inadequate in front of 50 people and offered no guidance about what adequate would look like, forcing the actor to find it without a map. This was not sadism. This was Ford's theory of performance. Strip the actor down to what was actually there, and then film that. The problem with Maureen O'Hara, the problem that Ford encountered in 1941 on the set of How Green Was My Valley, and that he had been turning over in his mind for a decade by the time they reached Ireland, was that she did not have the defensive layers his method was designed to remove. She arrived already stripped, already present, already inside the truth of whatever she was doing with a completeness that his pressure could not increase because it was already complete. You cannot strip someone who has nothing on. Ford ran the silence test on her for 4 days on Stage 7 in Hollywood in 1941. 4 days of watching every take she delivered and saying nothing. Not good, not bad, not try it differently, nothing. He moved on to the next setup after each take as though her performance had not registered with him at all. Most actors collapsed under this. The silence felt like erasure, like the director had looked at their work and decided it was not worth commenting on. The actor began to reach toward what they imagined Ford wanted, toward any signal from him that would tell them they had arrived somewhere useful. And in reaching, they lost the thing that had been there before they reached. Maureen O'Hara delivered the same performance on day 4 that she had delivered on day 1. Same quality. Same interior truth. Same complete presence. She had not reached. She had not adjusted. She had not looked to him for the verdict on whether what she was doing was good. Ford watched the takes from all 4 days in sequence that evening in his office and then sat in the dark for a long time. She doesn't need me to destabilize her, he understood. She's already arrived somewhere I can't reach with pressure. He recalibrated. If the silence test would not work, he would try the public correction. Week 6 of How Green Was My Valley. Full crew. A complicated scene. Ford called cut after her take and said, in front of 41 people, in the flat and authoritative voice he used when delivering verdicts, that was wrong. Do you understand why it was wrong? The crew held its breath. They had seen this before. They knew the shape of what came next, the actor's face changing, the small collapse behind the eyes, the effortful composure that tried to hide the collapse and never fully succeeded. They had seen it from people who were stronger and more experienced than an actress in her early 20s, who had been in Hollywood for less than 2 years. Maureen O'Hara looked at Ford. She did not flush, did not look at the floor, did not arrange her face into the expression of someone receiving a correction gracefully. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, directly, without adjustment, with a particular quality of stillness that was not the stillness of suppression, but the stillness of someone who was not in conflict about what was happening. Then she said 4 words. Tell me what you saw. 4 words. Not a defense, not an apology. Not the performed humility of an actor trying to demonstrate that they can receive criticism without ego. A question. A genuine, precise, professional question that said, I am not accepting your verdict until I understand the evidence for it. I am not adjusting until I know what I am adjusting toward. I am not moving until I understand where you need me to go. This was checkmate in the psychological hierarchy Ford had spent 40 years constructing. His entire method depended on the actor accepting, at some level, that his authority was the final word on the quality of what they were doing. That his silence meant failure, and his correction meant they were wrong, and his approval was the destination. Every technique he used, the silence test, the public correction, the unexplained redirection, required the actor to be oriented toward him, to be navigating by his responses. Tell me what you saw said. I am not navigating by your responses. I am navigating by the truth of the work. Your response is information I want to understand, not a verdict I am accepting. In 40 years of directing, no one had said this to him. No one had been in a sufficient position of internal security to say it. It required a level of self-knowledge and professional clarity that Ford's pressure was specifically designed to prevent. The pressure was supposed to produce disorientation, and disorientation was supposed to produce compliance. She was not disoriented. She was asking him what he saw. He said, your character already knows what she is going to say. She shouldn't. She should be finding it as she speaks. Maureen O'Hara held this for 3 seconds. A real 3 seconds, with actual processing in them. Then she nodded once. They reset. She filmed the scene again. This time the words arrived found rather than retrieved. The difference was below the surface of what could be easily named but completely visible to a camera and to a director who had spent 40 years learning to see exactly this kind of thing. Ford said nothing when she finished. He stood behind the camera for a moment longer than necessary. Then he moved on. What changed after that moment was not Ford's behavior toward her. He remained exacting. He continued to push, to redirect, to demand more and different and better with the unceasing pressure that was his signature and his gift. He did not become gentle. He did not become easy. He did not become anything other than what he was. What changed was the nature of the pressure. Before the 4 words, Ford was using psychological warfare to destabilize. After the 4 words, he was using exaction to refine. The target of his attention was no longer her defenses. She had demonstrated she had none worth attacking. The target was the work itself. He was no longer trying to strip her down to what was real. He was working directly with what was real, which was already present, and trying to make it as precise and complete as it could possibly be. This is the distinction the histories miss when they describe their collaboration as a war of wills. It was not a war of wills. It was 2 people of absolute professional seriousness working at the highest level each of them could reach, and the friction between them was not the friction of opposition but the friction of precision. The specific heat generated when someone is being asked to be not just good but exactly right. In 1952, The Quiet Man opened. The critical vocabulary ran out of words for what Ford and O'Hara had made together. Critics reached for authentic and charged and alive, and none of them quite arrived at the thing they were trying to name, which was the quality produced when a director who believed in stripping everything false away meets an actress who arrived with nothing false to begin with. The result of that meeting, across 5 films in 20 years, is some of the most genuinely present work in the history of American cinema. Frames where the camera is not capturing a performance, but recording something that is actually happening. Scenes where the audience leans forward not because the editing has manipulated them into it, but because they can feel, in some pre-linguistic way, that the people in the frame are not pretending. This was Ford's theory of performance, achieved through the most unexpected means. Not by breaking her down, by meeting someone who could not be broken down, and discovering that the method he had used on everyone else was entirely unnecessary here. That the thing he was trying to produce through 40 years of calculated psychological pressure was simply present in this woman, constitutively, as a fact about who she was. There is one more thing that needs to be said about that Galway hillside, about the moment Ford's hand was raised and the 43 people were waiting. What Ford did that day, the physical intrusion of it, the deliberate invasion of her space that he used as a last resort on actors who had survived everything else, was the most extreme version of his method. He had used it before, twice in his career, on men who had become so defended that he could find no other way through. Both times it had worked. Both times the actor had cracked, briefly and visibly, and Ford had filmed what was inside the crack, and the crack had been exactly what the scene needed. He used it on Maureen O'Hara on the Galway hillside because he had run out of other approaches. The silence had not destabilized her. The public correction had produced 4 words that reversed the power dynamic. The accumulated pressure of 3 weeks of unceasing exaction had refined her work without touching whatever was at the center of it. He reached for the last instrument. She did not crack. She looked at him, the same look she always gave him, direct, without adjustment. The look of someone who is not in conflict about what is happening to them because they know, at a level that precedes conscious decision, exactly who they are. Ford held her gaze for a long moment, then he stepped back. He walked to his director's chair and sat down and called for the crew to reset, and nobody on that set ever heard him speak about what had happened. Not that day, not in the weeks that followed, not in any of the interviews he gave in the years before his death. He had found the limit of his method. Not a defense, not a wall, just a person who was so completely and unassailably themselves that there was nothing in them for his pressure to act on. He filmed her for 20 more years. Every frame of it is the record of what that looks like. Ford died in 1973. In the years before his death, he gave a number of interviews in which he was asked about his methods, about the actors he had worked with, about the productions that had defined his career. He spoke about Wayne, about Fonda, about the technical and human difficulties of the films that had made his reputation. He spoke about Maureen O'Hara differently than he spoke about anyone else. He said, "She never needed what I gave the others. She was already there. I just had to learn to work with someone who was already there." He paused. "Most of my career I was trying to get people to arrive. With her, she was always waiting for me." About what it means to face a force that has broken everyone who came before you and refuse, not dramatically, not defiantly, but simply and completely, to move. About the invisible war that happens between 2 people of absolute professional will when one of them discovers that the other has no territory left to take. About 4 words that didn't end the war, they changed what it was for. Tell me what you saw. That's the Maureen O'Hara who stood on that Galway hillside while 43 people waited for her to break and understood, with complete and untroubled certainty, that she wasn't going to. The one Ford spent 20 years trying to direct. The one who was always already there. That's the one worth knowing.